The thunder of approaching artillery echoed through Berlin's shattered streets. 3 million Soviet soldiers pressed forward like an unstoppable tide. Their tanks crushed debris beneath steel treads. The earth shook with each explosive impact. Inside what remained of the Reichstag, desperate defenders clung to their posts. Boys who should have been in school gripped rifles with trembling hands. Old men who remembered the Great War found themselves in uniform once more. Death surrounded them on every side. The Nazi capital was transforming before their eyes. What had once been a symbol of power was becoming a graveyard. In less than 21 days, this transformation would be complete. The decisions that sealed Berlin's fate were as shocking as they were final. Red flames painted the night sky as April 1945 reached its brutal conclusion. Fire consumed what remained of proud buildings. Smoke rose in thick columns toward the heavens. Artillery thunder never ceased its deadly rhythm. Collapsing walls sent echoes bouncing between ruined structures. Burning timber crackled and hissed. Soldiers and civilians screamed in equal measure. The sound was unmistakable. A regime was dying. 12 years had passed since promises of a 1,000-year empire. Now those promises lay buried beneath rubble and ash. The great dome of the Reichstag rose through the chaos like a wounded giant. Its stone walls bore the blackened scars of battle. Every window had been blown out by concussion. Soviet shells continued their relentless bombardment. Red Army squads moved forward with methodical precision. Their rifles remained ready. Their eyes focused on one target above all others. From improvised bunkers and hastily built barricades, the last Nazi defenders returned fire. Their shots flew wild through the smoky air. They held positions that offered no real protection. The ruins they defended had already betrayed them. Above the constant noise of battle, history was being written. 2 Soviet scouts fought their way to the rooftop. Bullets whistled past their steel helmets. Smoke burned their eyes and throats. Their hands shook, but their resolve never wavered. They raised the scarlet banner high above the devastation. The hammer and sickle unfurled against the wind. The flag glowed red against a sky filled with ash and fire. This was more than symbolic cloth. This was the final proof that Hitler's empire had fallen. The world would never be the same. Berlin's collapse had not happened overnight. The city's destruction was the inevitable result of a massive struggle. This conflict had spanned entire continents. Millions of lives had been consumed. Every empire involved had been drained to its limits. The Nazi capital's transformation into a tomb of fire required understanding the days before the final battle. Europe lay in complete ruins by early 1945. Cities that had once echoed with music and laughter were hollow shells. Markets and theaters had been replaced by crater-filled wastelands. The Third Reich's confident march across the continent was collapsing. The weight of its own ambition was crushing it. From the Eastern Front, the Red Army pushed forward without stopping. From the Western Front, British, American, and French forces carved deeper into German territory. The noose was drawing tight. Berlin sat at its center. The heart of Nazi power still beat within its walls. Adolf Hitler continued to imagine victory was possible. Deep within the Führer bunker, he raged against what he saw as betrayal. His mind conjured salvation through one final stand. Reality told a different story entirely. The Wehrmacht was a shadow of its former strength. Divisions that had once thundered across Europe were now composed of exhausted boys, wounded veterans, and desperate old men. Their weapons were rifles and fading hope. Ammunition supplies had nearly disappeared. Fuel was almost gone. Morale had been shattered completely. Joseph Stalin viewed Berlin as more than enemy territory. For the Soviet leader, this was the ultimate triumph after his nation's sacrifice. 20 million Soviet lives had already been lost. Entire cities had been wiped from existence. Capturing Berlin was not simply a military goal for Stalin. This was justice, revenge, and destiny combined into one. He knew the Western Allies were advancing rapidly through Germany. Eisenhower and Churchill debated whether to seize Berlin themselves. Their hesitation cost precious time. Stalin made his vow. His armies would arrive first. Maps covered command tables throughout Moscow. The Soviet High Command planned their final strike with meticulous care. Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev assembled massive armies. 3 million soldiers stood ready. 6,000 tanks waited for orders. Tens of thousands of artillery pieces were positioned for maximum effect. This advance would not be cautious or measured. This would be an overwhelming storm designed to crush the Nazi capital within weeks. Berlin had been prepared as a fortress by Hitler's command. The city would be defended until the last man drew breath. Anti-aircraft guns were repositioned as field artillery. Trenches cut across major avenues. Barricades built from stone and wrecked vehicles blocked every intersection. The Volkssturm conscripted civilians, youth, and elderly citizens. They received Panzerfausts and orders to fight house by house. The regime proclaimed the city was invincible. The spirit of the German people would prevail against any odds. Beneath the propaganda, fear spread through every neighborhood. Families whispered about surrender behind closed doors. Mothers held their children close. They listened to distant Soviet artillery growing louder each day. This was a clash of military doctrines as much as armies. For the Germans, defense meant clinging to ruins. They would hold ground until their final breath. For the Soviets, offense meant constant pressure. A tidal wave of men and machines would crash forward without pause. Stalin demanded Berlin fall by May 1st. This would be his gift to Lenin's birthday. A symbolic offering to Soviet history. Europe's fate balanced on this single confrontation. Allied generals understood the stakes. Whoever entered Berlin first would shape the continent's future. Americans and British approached the city with caution. They feared enormous casualties. They preferred consolidating gains in the West. Stalin was willing to pay any price for victory. He ordered his marshals to break through regardless of cost. Spring had thawed the frozen fields of Eastern Europe. The stage was perfectly set. April 16, 1945, arrived with the Oder River before them. Berlin lay beyond its waters. The Red Army unleashed the opening barrage of history's most ferocious battle. The Red Army's advance toward Berlin was not a sudden rush. This was the culmination of years of brutal combat. Lessons had been written in blood on battlefields across Stalingrad, Kursk, and the Vistula. By 1945, the Soviet war machine had undergone complete transformation. From a force once battered in retreat, it had become Earth's most formidable army. 3 million Soviet soldiers prepared to strike Nazi Germany's heart. They came from Kazakhstan's steppes. They came from Siberian snows. They came from Ukrainian cities and Belarusian fields. Each soldier carried more than a rifle. Each bore memories of devastation left by German invasion. Their formation was military and personal combined. Every man and woman in uniform carried scars of loss. That loss fueled their determination to see Berlin fall. The arsenal assembled for this final blow defied comprehension. More than 6,000 tanks rolled forward. T-34s served as Soviet armor workhorses. Massive IS-2 heavy tanks carried 122mm guns. These weapons could rip open German fortifications like paper. Self-propelled guns rumbled alongside. Katyusha rocket launchers prepared for devastation. Over 40,000 artillery pieces stood ready for bombardment. Behind ground forces, the Soviet Air Force prepared thousands of aircraft. Bombers and fighters would darken German skies. This storm of steel and fire had no precedent in warfare. Yet this immense formation was more than machines and numbers. Ideology, discipline, and propaganda bound it together. Soviet newspapers proclaimed Europe's coming liberation. Posters painted Berlin as a lair of fascist beasts requiring destruction. Soldiers were told they carried the motherland's justice in their packs. Each step westward avenged a burned village. Each mile forward honored a family torn apart. In many hearts, this mission was sacred. They would raise the red banner above the enemy capital, whatever the cost might be. Berlin's defense preparations painted a stark contrast. Hitler's command insisted the city could withstand the Soviet tide. Reality revealed another truth entirely. Divisions once mighty were now hollowed shells. Weapons were scavenged from storage facilities. Outdated rifles were pressed into teenage and elderly hands. The so-called Volkssturm represented a desperate attempt to form armies from civilians. Boys barely 15 years old clutched Panzerfausts with trembling fingers. Old men who had served in the Great War were pulled into uniforms once more. Their eyes were weary with knowledge of futility. Nazi propaganda still blared through radio speakers. Posters were nailed to crumbling walls throughout the city. Berlin was declared a Festung, a fortress. Citizens were told surrender equaled treason. Victory was inevitable if they fought with fanatic resolve. Behind closed doors, whispers of doom spread like wildfire. Food had become scarce throughout the city. Bombing raids shattered daily life completely. Soviet artillery in the distance grew louder with each passing hour. The contrast between the two sides could not have been more extreme. On one side stood a Soviet force united by experience. Years of hard-won victories had reinforced them. Endless waves of men and machines supplied their advance. On the other side stood German defense, fragmented and exhausted. Their last reserves of youth and age were thrown into fire. Two storms were colliding with inevitable force. One gathered strength with each westward mile. The other dissipated under history's weight. For Stalin, this vast formation was not just military necessity. This was a political weapon of immense power. Every tank rolling forward proved Soviet determination. Every soldier crossing the Oder River demonstrated that the Soviet Union would decide Europe's fate. The Western Allies could not arrive in time to alter the balance. The Red Army was already at the gates. April advanced with Soviet marshals finalizing their deployment. The First Belarusian Front, under Marshal Zhukov, prepared. The First Ukrainian Front, under Marshal Konev, positioned for attack. The Second Belarusian Front, under Marshal Rokossovsky, coordinated the strike. All three fronts converged toward Berlin in coordinated assault. The trap was closing with mechanical precision. The jaws were tightening around their prey. Within the ruined capital, defenders braced for the storm they knew was coming. The morning of April 16, 1945, shattered the Oder River line's silence. More than 20,000 Soviet artillery pieces roared in perfect unison. Steel and fire hurled across German defenses at the Silo Heights. The earth trembled beneath the onslaught. The sky turned black with choking smoke. For 30 minutes, this barrage poured down like an unending storm. The intention was breaking defender willpower before infantry advanced. Marshal Georgy Zhukov commanded the First Belarusian Front. He had prepared a spectacle of overwhelming force. Searchlights blazed across the night sky. 150 lights aimed directly at German positions. The plan was blinding the defenders completely. They would be stunned into paralysis as Soviet soldiers surged forward. German forces had dug deep into bunkers and trenches. They were not easily broken by this display. As first Soviet waves advanced, machine guns rattled from hidden nests. Artillery fire answered the bombardment. Ground was torn by mines and obstacles. The Silo Heights became a slaughterhouse. For 3 days, battle raged across those bloody ridges. Soviet tanks bogged down in marshland. Infantry was cut down on open ground. Casualties mounted into tens of thousands. Stalin's impatience grew with each passing hour. He threatened Zhukov with disgrace if the heights did not fall swiftly. He warned that Konev's southern front might seize Berlin first. Zhukov faced enormous pressure. He threw in his reserves without hesitation. More divisions poured into the cauldron. Slowly and brutally, German lines bent under pressure. Then, they broke completely. By April 19th, the Silo defenses were crushed beyond repair. The road to Berlin lay wide open. South of the city, Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front surged forward with greater success. They exploited weak German coordination ruthlessly. Armored spearheads punched through enemy lines. They drove toward the capital's southern districts. To the north, Marshal Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front pinned down German forces. This prevented any relief from reaching Berlin. Soviet jaws of steel were closing from every direction. Within Berlin, battle sounds grew ever closer. Residents heard distant artillery rumbles clearly. They felt tremors beneath their feet. Civilians fled into cellars, clutching what little food remained. Hitler issued orders for counterattacks that never materialized. The 12th Army faced the Western Allies initially. It was ordered eastward to relieve the capital. The army was already shattered beyond repair. Its soldiers were exhausted completely. They could not break through Soviet lines. The march toward Berlin was measured in blood, not miles. Soviet soldiers crossed rivers under constant fire. Their bodies were carried away by swift currents. Tank crews pushed forward through burning villages. Their machines were scarred with shell impacts. Pilots streaked overhead, dueling with Luftwaffe remnants. German fuel supplies had dwindled to nothing. Each day, Soviet advance pressed closer. Each day, German defense fractured further. Atmosphere among Soviet ranks was tense and heavy with expectation. They knew this was the final chapter. Letters written by soldiers spoke of vengeance. They spoke of longing to return home after years of war. Yet they also spoke of dread and knowledge. Berlin would be the most dangerous fight of all. A city turned fortress where every doorway could conceal an enemy. The men tightened grips on rifles. They whispered prayers and marched forward. By April 23rd, Soviet spearheads had reached the city's outer districts. Berlin's spires and smokestacks rose against the horizon. They were silhouetted by fire against the sky. The Reich's capital was within reach. Stalin urged his commanders onward with increasing urgency. He demanded the city be taken before May Day. The world's eyes were upon them. The Red Army forged in the Eastern Front's inferno was about to deliver final judgment. Soviet columns encircled Berlin, sealing millions of fates. There would be no escape from this trap. No reprieve would come. No miracle would save the Third Reich. The defenders were trapped completely. The attackers were relentless. The march to battle had ended. The battle for Berlin itself was about to begin. April 25, 1945, saw the jaws of steel snap shut. Zhukov from the east, Konev from the south, Rokossovsky from the north converged their armies. Berlin, once the Reich's proud heart, was surrounded and cut off from the world. Inside, nearly 2 million civilians and Wehrmacht remnants braced for annihilation. Soviet artillery thunder shook the city without pause. This was the sound of inevitability approaching. Streets that had once hosted Nazi triumph parades were now barricaded with rubble. The Tiergarten became a battlefield of craters and burning trees. Apartment blocks transformed into fortresses. Every building became a stronghold. Every window became a firing position. The defenders fought with desperate resolve. SS fanatics, Volkssturm boys, and weary Wehrmacht veterans wielded Panzerfausts from behind corners. They hurled grenades down stairwells. They sniped from church towers. For every block taken, the Red Army paid in blood. Soviet tanks rumbled down wide avenues. Their steel tracks ground over cobblestones. In the narrow city labyrinth, they became targets. Panzerfaust rockets struck at close range. They tore open armor. They engulfed crews in fire. Nearly 2,000 Soviet armored vehicles were destroyed in Berlin alone. Infantry advanced house by house systematically. They broke through walls with explosives. They cleared stairwells with bayonets. The battle was a mosaic of small, savage struggles. Soldiers fought not only for victory, but for survival. Streets were drenched with smoke and screams. Above the city, the Luftwaffe was merely a memory. Soviet aircraft circled freely, pounding strongholds into dust. Bombers turned railway stations into twisted steel skeletons. Fighters strafed any movement they detected. This included military and civilian targets alike. Still, the defenders clung to their ruins. They were unwilling or unable to surrender. Hitler's orders demanded resistance to the last man. Inside the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler lived in complete delusion. Maps covered the walls showing divisions that no longer existed. He issued commands to phantom armies. He demanded counterattacks from generals who had no troops left to move. As shells rocked the city above, he raged at betrayal. The Waffen-SS, the Wehrmacht, even his closest ministers had all failed him. His body trembled uncontrollably. His speech slurred constantly. But his obsession remained unchanged. Berlin must not fall to the enemy. For Berlin's people, tragedy deepened each hour. Civilians cowered in basements as artillery shells collapsed their homes. Water and food were scarce. Fires consumed entire districts completely. Mothers tried to hush their crying children. Soviet soldiers drew closer by the hour. Their footsteps echoed in shattered streets. Rumors spread of atrocities and revenge for years of suffering inflicted upon the East. Fear and despair mingled with the choking smoke of a dying city. By April 29th, the last bastion of Nazi resistance centered around the Reichstag and government quarter. This once grand symbol of German power lay in ruins. Its stone walls were cracked beyond repair. Its dome was shattered completely. Yet, to Hitler and his loyalists, it remained sacred ground. SS men and Hitler youth, armed with little more than machine guns and Panzerfausts, turned the building into a fortress. Soviet artillery answered with unrelenting bombardment. Columns shook violently. Statues crumbled to pieces. Flames licked at the foundations. Then came the final assault. Waves of Soviet infantry stormed the Reichstag steps. They clashed with defenders in brutal close combat. Grenades exploded in marble corridors. Machine gun fire rattled across staircases. Blood stained the stone floors. Floor by floor, room by room, the Red Army fought its way upward. They were determined to seize this symbol of Nazi power. By nightfall, amid smoke and chaos, 2 Soviet scouts reached the rooftop. Under enemy fire, they raised the red banner high above the ruined dome. Against a sky of ash, the hammer and sickle declared Berlin's fall. The psychological blow was immense and immediate. Across the city, German soldiers saw the flag and knew the truth. Their cause was lost beyond redemption. Still, fighting dragged on relentlessly. Each pocket of resistance refused to yield. But nothing could alter the final outcome. The Reichstag had fallen completely. With it fell the illusion of survival. In the bunker below, Hitler's world unraveled completely. On the evening of April 29th, he married Eva Braun in a brief, somber ceremony. The next day, with Soviet forces only blocks away, he dictated his final will. He named successors, placing Admiral Dönitz as head of state. Then, on April 30th, as artillery shells thundered above, Hitler and Eva retreated to a small room. A single gunshot cracked through the air. The dictator was dead. His empire, already in ruins, now had no head. News of Hitler's death spread quickly through Berlin. Some defenders laid down their arms, collapsing in complete exhaustion. Others fought on with suicidal fury. They were determined to die in the rubble. In the bunker, Joseph Goebbels assumed command for less than 1 day. On May 1st, he and his wife poisoned their 6 children. Then they took their own lives. The city above them burned, but the bunker became a tomb of its own. By May the 2nd, Soviet forces had crushed the last organized resistance. General Helmuth Weidling, commander of Berlin's defense, signed the unconditional surrender of the city. Exhausted soldiers streamed into captivity. Civilians emerged from cellars, blinking in the light of a ruined world. The battle had ended, but its devastation was total and complete. Berlin's climax was both victory and tragedy combined. Victory for the Red Army, who avenged years of suffering and claimed the war's final prize. Tragedy for Berlin's people, who paid the price of a war their leaders had unleashed. Above the ruins, the red flag fluttered as a symbol of triumph forged in blood. The guns of Berlin finally fell silent on May 2, 1945. The once mighty capital of the Reich was reduced to rubble and ash. Its avenues were littered with tank wreckage. Its buildings were hollowed out by fire. The roar of battle gave way to eerie stillness. This silence was broken only by survivors' sobs and the rumble of Soviet columns entering the city. Berlin had surrendered completely. The war in Europe was gasping its last breath. Marshal Zhukov received capitulation from General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the city's defenses. Weidling, weary and resigned, admitted the truth. Further resistance was impossible. Thousands of German soldiers laid down their arms. They marched into captivity with hollow eyes and empty stomachs. They were remnants of a broken army, stripped of hope. They walked toward an uncertain fate behind barbed wire. For the Red Army, Berlin's fall was both triumph and exhaustion. 3 million men had marched westward. Now they stood inside the enemy's capital. Victory was undeniable, but it had been purchased at staggering cost. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers lay buried in the city's ruins. Their blood mingled with the Reich's dust. Tank crews who had fought through Kursk were gone. Infantry who had survived Stalingrad met their end on Berlin's streets. The price of final victory was as heavy as any battle before it. The city itself bore scars too deep to heal quickly. More than 1 million civilians had endured the siege. They emerged from cellars to find their homes destroyed. Their neighbors were gone. Their city was unrecognizable. Hunger gnawed at them constantly. Fear lingered in their eyes. Some saw the Red Army as liberators. Others saw them as conquerors. For all, the experience was marked by despair and uncertainty. In the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, the new Nazi leadership unraveled within days. Hitler's death had left a vacuum no one could fill. Joseph Goebbels, who briefly assumed power, ended his life in poison and fire. Admiral Karl Dönitz, designated as Hitler's successor, fled north to form a so-called government. But the world no longer listened. Berlin's fall signaled the end not only of a city, but of the entire Nazi state. Across Europe, news spread swiftly through every nation. In London, church bells rang in celebration. In Washington, flags were raised in triumph. Yet for Western Allied soldiers who had advanced deep into Germany, there was bitter recognition. They had fought their way across rivers and forests, but it was the Soviets who had claimed the final prize. The shape of the post-war world was already being decided in Berlin's ashes. For Stalin, the outcome was more than military glory. It was proof of the Soviet Union's supremacy. A message to allies and enemies alike. His armies had endured the war's heaviest blows. Now they stood victorious in Europe's heart. Berlin's fall secured the Soviet claim to Eastern Europe, a claim that would echo through decades to come. But amid the political triumph, the human toll remained undeniable. Streets were filled with columns of prisoners of war, escorted by Soviet guards. Civilians searched through rubble for loved ones' bodies. Fires smoldered for days, choking the air with smoke. The mighty Reich that had once dreamed of global domination ended in silence, ruin, and surrender. The immediate aftermath of Berlin's fall was a paradox of joy and grief. For the Allies, it marked Hitler's empire's collapse. For the Soviets, it was justice delivered at last. For Berlin's people, it was catastrophe and reckoning for years of war. Yet no matter how it was seen, the battle had closed a chapter of history forever. The city that once embodied the Nazi dream now stood as its grave. Berlin's fall was more than a city's collapse. It was the end of an empire built on terror. It was the birth of a new world order. On May 8, 1945, in a ruined building in the German capital, Wehrmacht representatives signed the act of unconditional surrender. At that moment, the war in Europe was officially over. The Third Reich, which had promised dominance for 1,000 years, had lasted barely more than a decade. For the Soviet Union, capturing Berlin became the crowning jewel of its wartime struggle. Raising the red flag over the Reichstag was immortalized in photographs, posters, and monuments. It symbolized not only victory over Nazi Germany, but also the USSR's emergence as a global superpower. On Berlin's blood-soaked streets, Stalin secured not just battlefield triumph, but political leverage that would shape the Cold War to come. Every year afterward, on May 9th, Red Square in Moscow echoed with parade thunder. Tanks rolled across the cobblestones. Soldiers marched in perfect ranks. Jets roared overhead. The ritual was more than commemoration. It was a declaration that the great patriotic war's sacrifices would never be forgotten. The Soviet people had earned their place in history through unimaginable suffering and unwavering resolve. For Germany, the legacy was much darker. Berlin became a divided city, split by occupation zones and eventually by the infamous wall of concrete and barbed wire. The ruins of 1945 gave way to the stage of ideological confrontation. East against West, communism against capitalism. The final battle's scars remained visible in every street, in every family torn apart by war and politics alike. For the world, Berlin's lessons were stark and undeniable. The battle demonstrated unchecked tyranny's cost, and the price paid when ambition blinds reason. It revealed extremes of human endurance, both the savagery of desperate defense and the relentless will of an advancing army. It warned that wars do not simply end with victory. They leave shadows that linger for generations. In the end, Berlin 1945 stands as both a symbol of destruction and a monument to resilience. A reminder that empires built on fear can fall in fire. The fate of nations can be decided in a single city, in a single moment, beneath the thunder of guns and the flutter of a flag.